Aidan Newman is the managing director of Outside Music. Outside Music is an independent record label roster that includes a number of award-winning artists. It's one of the leading independent distributors in Canada. Some of the artists that Outside Music has worked with include Jill Barber, The Weather Station, Rose Cousins, Aidan Knight, and Justin Rutledge. In 2019, Outside Music launched Next Door Records, a new label designed to provide equitable support and creative freedom to their songwriting community. I spoke with Evan about Next Door's mandate and what it means for fostering work that engages with the politics of our climate emergency. In a condition of crisis, what can musicians do beyond what they're doing, writing songs? Can they use what Evan describes as their stature to not only move audiences but also encourage movement at the policy level to respond to carbon-intensive human activities, like how folks get to shows, how they get their music, and whether they're producing all kinds of plastic waste at those shows? Evan runs Outside Music with the passion of a fan. In this conversation, he talks about how the rationale for who they work with does come down to who they're inspired by, the music they feel really needs to be heard. Part of this is also built on the faith that, as he says here, music can enact change. If it's true that, and I agree with him on this point, the overwhelming deluge of information from news and other sources isn't necessarily communicating the urgency of eco-catastrophe, then music might need to not only move people, but move into a place of mobilizing people. The way it does that is through communicating a language of feeling, speaking to people's anger, anxiety, their stress, and even their solipsism, letting them into the conversation about what climate politics should look like. As an educator in the music business program at the Nova Scotia Community College, he says he's working with young people who are attuned to the reality of the climate crisis and curious about how to craft a way of working with artists that is environmentally ethical. He clearly derives some hope from knowing that these folks are working to figure out ways of changing an industry that, in his words, is still necessarily tethered to capitalism. The mere fact that a new generation is entering the conversation about how music and climate change, arts and commerce, the environment and consumerism means that transformation could become easier to imagine. I'll be discussing these issues with Evan along with Shannon Miedema, Kim Fry, Joanna Bull, Way Mason, and Braden Lamb this Wednesday, April 26th, at Halifax's Central Library. It's a free event titled Changing the Tune on Climate, and it's going to feature a number of performances by artists like Aquaculture, T. Thomason, the Gilberts, and Kristen Martell. We hope you'll attend, and it's going to be a celebration of music, but also an interesting discussion of environmental justice. I wanted to ask you about running a label, running a record label, and doing so sustainably. It's the case that whether you choose to release records today via vinyl or streaming, either way, you're kind of participating in, what Imre Zeman and other people have called petroculture. And so, that's a tricky thing if you're trying to run a label in a way that is environmentally ethical. How do you think about the ways that the music industry can be less carbon intensive? And I guess in particular, the music publishing industry.
Yeah, record labels are culprits in, climate emergency. And it's something that, because, it's arts and commerce, right? Where the arts, the musicians, the artists are very cognizant and very aware of, and that's been since the beginning of time in music, of environmental issues and wanting to address them and wanting to be able to contribute to the saving of the environment through climate action. But for us they're making records. There's a huge carbon imprint from touring, from the making of physical product, the ingestion of streaming music. There's just the music industry itself is a large contributor to environmental problems. And it's something that, theoretically, all of us, labels, artists, everyone involved, really want to change. And there's been a lot of talk and a lot of issues and a lot of events, a lot of protests on how we do it. A lot of, I think the core activity from the artists is trying to push the government to enact some sort of legislation in using their platform. And if you look at it internally, and that platform is on a broader scale, internally for the music business, it's a tough road to navigate.
It really is. And I like that you point out that like the solutions have to obviously come at the structural level. Like I think so often we do tend to like reduce the quality or the question or the pace of change to like these individual actors and sort of extol the virtues of one particular, let's say, label. You know, those manufacturers, those labels are all bound up in a much more complex system, right?
Mhm.
um, and you're necessarily kind of in some you kind of sucked into competing within that space. And so yeah, I think like that negotiation, being aware of that is really key. And then like, you know, outside music, right, this is the label. it's
Yep.
it's it's clear that like your label is attempting to balance the commitment to, I would say, like more experimental, maybe boundary pushing and politically conscious music,
Mhm.
like balancing that with staying commercially viable. I wondered if you wanted to speak to that, but also if you could like point to just particular examples of records that you think do that exceptionally well.
One of the initiatives we started a couple years ago was a label under the outside music umbrella called Next Door Records. And Next Door Records had a mandate of working with marginalized artists and younger artists and artists who had a political bent. And one of the first ones that we worked with who had come over from outside music is an artist by the name of The Weather Station.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that is Tamara Lindemann. And she was basically, um, became self-taught, self-aware, self-educated on climate emergency and became actively involved and sort of, had a feeling of helplessness and wanted to enact some sort of change. And she made a record called Ignorance. And it was about basically her observations of, the climate crisis and her take on being on the road and what's happening in the world. And she used her platform because that record got global acclaim, Juno nominated, got shortlisted for the Players Prize, got huge features in the New York Times and other big publications. And she used that platform to address, like, this is something that's of huge concern for her. And she wrestles with the facts of, being a touring artist. And she understands that by being on the road, by creating this physical product, that she's participating in the things she's actively protesting against. And it's a problem for her, to wrestle with that. And for us, we're tethered to capitalism. And with capitalism comes, like, we have to provide this product in order to earn revenue, in order to do the things we want to do, pay salaries and all that. And we have to be strategic because it's a consideration. It's a massive consideration on our part as a company. It's our responsibility to be like, okay, do we press product, physical product for this artist, or do we just sustain it through digital only, which is still a footprint, but nowhere near as large if we're pressing 1,000 records? Because there are many times where you'll press 1,000 records and you'll be left with 500. When there's the pandemic, like we were sitting on a lot of product. And after a while, it becomes obsolescence and we have to destroy it.
Mm.
So it's also minimizing our imprint by, having, realistic forecasts. But then it's just like, if we under manufacture and then the artist is going on tour, they're like, well, I need more, because that's the way they sustain themselves on tour, through the sales of merchandise, because the margins are at least better because they're, not making much money on the live circuit because the costs are so high.
Mm.
If we think of the artist being able to maintain their living by performance or, the exploitation, for lack of a better word, of recorded music, and balancing that with environmental responsibility.
That title concept of ignorance is so interesting and sort of generates so many thoughts around like how frequently these kinds of pieces of information, like the one you just gave us, right, this sort of data dump of all of the things that we should feel conflicted about, leave us vexed but with nowhere to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ignorance is like this really, to me, interesting concept, because the actual like explicit way that she in the album, like in the liner art for the album, articulates the potential of ignorance is that, you know, it is a potentiality. It's not something that limits you.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that if you attempt in any way to remedy it, actually kind of empowers you, you know, like, and that to me is Lindemann's like really remarkable insight when it comes to like the power of music.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is this idea that, you know, leading up to this, I think ultimately canceled mega event, the Big Climate Thing festival, she was interviewed by Rolling Stone and said, like, this is a huge opportunity for people to collect and work through, in the way that music allows them to, all of the unsettled feelings that we typically feel in relationship to the climate crisis. And I guess like just kind of zooming out in some ways, like, you know, both of us are going to be participating pretty soon in this event called Changing the Tune on Climate. You know, I wondered what sort of brought you to want to participate in that specific event. You know, if it was in part about sort of trying to undo or sort of engage with the kinds of ignorance that people have, or if it is more about like just trying to communicate the potential power of music with its acuity for communicating emotion, the power that it has to kind of move people on the question of climate action.
Yeah, I mean, I think music can enact change and can influence people's decisions and can make, you know, a younger generation or even an older generation aware of what's at stake, because, you know, we're inundated with, you know, a lot of news, and it's hard for people not to look at the climate crisis and be like, I can't take that on right now. I can't listen to the radio, I can't watch TV, I can't read anything in the news and absorb it. So perhaps music as an outlet or as a form of communicating what that is, whether it's through ignorance or just through live performance, and people of stature can say these things to, you know, their audience. But mainly my, you know, willingness to participate in something like this is to have a conversation, to collaborate with other people and be like, you know, where do we go? There has to be some element of action, some sort of concrete plan that, you know, artists can enact. And I'm also a teacher at the Nova Scotia Community College in the music business program, where, you know, I have people who are in their early 20s looking to get into the music business. And these are people who are really switched on to climate crisis and wondering how, as they're starting to immerse themselves in the music business, is what can they do? And I think a lot of ideas have been exchanged through, you know, a group of music industry professionals. But, you know, now that we have this younger generation coming up who have grown up in the thick of a climate crisis, and it's sort of top of mind for them, you know, I'm hoping they can come out and they can see sort of and contribute to the conversation of what they can bring to the table. I don't think at the moment anyone's doing anything beyond bringing attention to the crisis and trying to keep it top of mind. It becomes, when you look at a global climate crisis and you're like, what do I do? How can I'm one little person. And, you know, it's like before, you know, it became the responsibility of the individual. You got to recycle, you got to do this. And it was like the corporations were able to, you know, shift the narrative to, it's not us, you guys need to do the work. We're doing fine. And
Sure.
And when you're battling that, it tends to suck the life out of you.
Absolutely. You know, it's just like ignorance becomes like a burden sort of foisted onto the individual, right? And education becomes this kind of magic bullet answer. It's not that education is unimportant, but unless there are, I agree, like things happening at the regulatory level in terms of like industrial policy or around transportation in particular, there's no, it's difficult for us to imagine anything like materially. And so I think like it's sort of, I'm hearing this term more and more in relationship to the climate crisis and climate communication and action. It's like, it's all hands on deck. I mean, it's artists, it's people who are running labels, you know, it's the public, right? This kind of figure that we like to invoke that is kind of this vague thing. and all of these things sort of interlocking and interoperating, I think, to like demand the kinds of change that will allow, especially as you say, young people who for whom it's top of mind to enter into the music space and thrive and not necessarily have to worry about what they're sacrificing, compromising, and all of those things. One of the things that you gestured to that I think is really worth thinking about, and that I know, Music Declares Emergency is especially sort of wary of, is this question of touring. I mean, like, the music industry is at a moment, I talked to Kim Fry about this, where, inflation and fuel costs and all kinds of things are converging to make it difficult for even very, very prominent artists to tour. And they're changing the way that they're touring as a result. Mm-hmm. And yet you still see mega events like Coachella happen in the California desert during a historically unprecedented mega drought. Mm-hmm. Like, see these things happen on and get reported on by the music press, like Pitchfork, as though there shouldn't be some ambivalence about that. That the point is Frank Ocean giving a lackluster performance, not the irony of having this mega spectacle in the desert during a mega drought. I wondered if you could speak to, because I'm really curious about like how to just grow the local, how to make people travel less and make local performance feel viable and exciting. Like, what are the advantages and also disadvantages that are wrapped up in or bound up in this idea of trying to think locally about selling, as it were, music events like performance and so on?
The most expensive food is always the organic and the natural food and produce, mm-hmm. whereas the cheapest is the junk food and the sodas and whatnot. And it's probably the biggest cost for a country like Canada is healthcare. Mm-hmm. But yet, if they were to incentivize a program where the better food was cheaper than the bad food, then you would limit the amount of money that goes into healthcare, treating diabetes and obesity and whatnot. But the people who are on low income or moderate income or even high income cannot, are not forking out that money. So I look at it, I can compare that to the environmental crisis with artists. There's going to be a huge cost for environmental pollution, and we've already experienced it. So mm-hmm. to look at it and say, like, how do we, where do we spend our money? So if you're an artist and touring, like, is there an incentive program to, use, where they subsidize artists who are not, they don't have to go travel all around to Vancouver. It's not like, you cannot sustain yourself in a place like Halifax, because there are about 4 venues in the entire city. Yeah. And it's a point of saturation. So it's like, I've always said to artists I work with and my students is that there's a great population base, a dense population base between Halifax and Toronto, all along the 401 Trans-Canada Highway. Stick to that. Still, that's going to cause, that's a lot of fuel. That's a few thousand kilometers going back and forth. But what if there was an incentive program to be like, hey, if you rent an electric vehicle, and travel in that, like, we'll give you, X amount of dollars, to offset those costs, mm-hmm. To incentivize the artist to look elsewhere, or to cover that cost of what it would be to rent or purchase, an electric, which is, a lot of artists can barely afford to rent, the Dodge Caravan.
Yeah.
So it becomes, you're sort of at a point where, like, the only way we can tour is in the 1985 Econoline that is, horrible for the environment, and because it's not sustainable. Like, touring itself is not sustainable, and that's economically. So environmentally, it's detrimental. So it's a hard thing to reckon with, because you can't really micro tour. You can't sort of tour locally and earn a living, because there just are not enough spots to play. So you have to tour. There's a band out in Vancouver or Victoria who just broke up, but they had converted an RV to run on vegetable oil. And, like, if there was a program to incentivize artists to, or at least give them access to methods to reduce their carbon imprint, like, I think it would be, a little more sustainable. I don't know how much of a change it would make, mm-hmm. Because you're not going to, like, the promoters and the venues are not going to, do an environmental tax that's going to do anything, because no one, right. You want to keep ticket costs as low as possible, but
Hmm.
it's you have to balance. If you're going to be an artist, and the only way you're making money is on the road, and that's your biggest outlay of you know carbon emissions. That it's how do you weigh that? So you
Hmm.
can go back and go like, what? Spotify and all the DSP, the streaming services, if they paid more, there'd be less reason for artists. Like a lot of artists, if they don't tour, I had a friend of mine who was saying he was on tour. He's like, if I don't play a show, I lose $600. He's like, I need to play, in order to maintain it. So but if these DSPs paid more, then the artist wouldn't have to sort of tour as much. They could tour more strategically. Our
Hmm.
philosophy that we try to impart to our artists is less shows, more money,
Hmm.
and and in turn, less of an impact on the environment if you're able to do that.
Right. And I mean, like, I just so appreciate you kind of making that visual in a way for people, like just trying to give them a sense of the reality of artists who are in many cases just scraping by, and how that the market basically dictates these kinds of tough choices. Because I think, the average person in some ways doesn't, I don't think necessarily grasps the kind of unglamorous reality of making music and trying to sustain a life making music. We celebrate, and for good reason, the energy and the creativity of musicians, and we're fed also, I think, like certain stories about musicians. I just recently watched the documentary Meet Me in the Bathroom, which is about the birth of the scene in New York City in the early aughts with the Strokes and Yeah Yeah Yeahs and Interpol and all these incredible bands. And very quickly, the narrative shifts to like showing the Strokes flying to the UK, right? Like it's that invasion mentality that the industry still kind of wants to sell the public in some ways. That the legitimate artist is the artist that invades new markets. But I think like the method or approach to exposure that you're describing, which is a more caring approach, I would say,
Mm.
is to me more exciting and more enticing, And I guess the question for me is like, do you think as a label runner about how to sell that model, which is a model that says like the health benefits of music itself for people's psychology and their even physical well-being are undisputed, right? But what we're trying to connect that to is this idea that we also need to think globally about the health effects of staging these mega events where people have to travel from all over the place, and we know what the carbon imprint is. Like, how do you just like draw the connection in a convincing way in order to get to that place where we inhabit a healthier ecosystem for that fosters the health effects of music?
It's incredibly hard. Like I look at
Right.
it, and I see the issue at play, and the possible solutions, and it's hard to so like how would you enable these things to happen?
Mm.
Like when you look at, I know part of the discussion next week is in regards to the Junos. I remember when they were in Saskatoon a few years ago, actually right right before they were canceled. At the time, basically day of, as COVID started, Air Canada had added a bunch of flights,
Mm.
Toronto to Saskatoon. Taxi companies were arming themselves with as many cars as possible. And you look at it and you're like, wow, like how much, the increase, if you were to, if they actually went off, the measurement of an environmental impact versus a regular day in Saskatoon would probably be astronomical.
Mm. Hmm.
Why is this happening? And it's again comes to money, where it's like, these cities bid for the ability to host these events because they look at it and they're like, all these people from around the country are coming to this event, and they are paying money to stay in the hotels, eat at restaurants, do all the things, and it's supposed to provide this huge boost to the economy.
Mm.
I don't know the exact figures. I don't know exactly how much an event like this will contribute to the economy, but do they measure how much the environmental impact is of something like this?
Right.
And if you go, and I'm from Toronto, don't hold it against me. But and recently moved here, and I know that everyone who's coming, a majority of the music industry is in Toronto. So they're adding probably they will add flights from Toronto to Halifax. And I'm like, why are we doing this? Why are we bringing, even when I went to the Nova Scotia Music Week in Sydney, it was basically transporting Halifax to Sydney. And the same thing, it was just like, there's a great music scene here, but it's incredibly small. But they're basically bringing in, Toronto to Halifax, and and there's, I would guess, probably 70% of the attendees are from Toronto, and there's got to be a better way. How do we make it so the cities can have this cash injection, but at what cost?
Yeah, this is a big part of the push and one of the major talking points of the Changing the Tune event. And when I talked to Kim Fry about that objective, and she said something really, really fascinating. She said, like, when a big sports event comes to a city, the trade-off is always this thing of, like, we're going to have a massive influx of capital. We're going to have a flood of people into the city, and that will be a benefit. But the thing that she noted is that, like, the difference when it comes to a sporting event, to some extent, a city will also see an infrastructure boost where, like, that major sport event, whatever it may, Canada Games, blah, 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 you'll see, like, a new facility emerge out of nowhere, right? Suddenly the city can find the money, and cities are cash strapped relative to provinces and the federal government, blah, blah, blah. But the key point was just that why is it that we never imagine a major music event having a lasting positive, even economic impact on a local, like a community? When it comes to sporting events, like we do see a positive change to, like, the infrastructure and this sort of imagined or real health benefits of that. We don't think in those terms when it comes to music. Like, you spoke to the number of venues in Halifax. It feels to me like it should be possible to conceive of how a big event like this would also see the emergence, hopefully, of some new infrastructure for fostering the creation of music in the city. Do you see that kind of structural piece as kind of missing from the initiative of greening the Junos, or is that, like, maybe a bridge too far in terms of policy? I don't know.
Well, always. I mean, I think that's always the case. Like, even with Toronto, they were like, we're going to be a music city. And then, shuttering all these venues because they couldn't afford the rent. And then they were ticketing, vans that would pull up to venues to load in things, and they had some performative gestures. I think the bottom line, it feels like, you can measure the Junos in a way like a concert. It's like once you turn the lights on after the show, all you see is scattered beer bottles and gum and whatnot left on the floor. So it's like, there's great benefit. The Junos are a great organization. Karis is a great organization, and they definitely have the best of intentions, but it's also a TV show.
Right.
The Junos, it's also they employ a lot of people, and a lot of people get these temporary job placements because of this. So you need the government involvement to be like, hey, you know what, this is great. Let's look at a multi-purpose facility, but let's just make our city more attractive to arts. Let's create more venues. Let's give them rent relief. Let's give them opportunity to have these spaces because they're so valuable for community. These spaces are needed to foster community. It's like, if you're getting youth who are interested in music, having an there's the all ages venue, the Palladium down in the Commons, just like a place to experience music, and a lot of the artists are now not being able to live in the city, because of the high cost of living. So it's a real tough gig being an artist right now. So when you look at a place like Halifax, it's just like, Halifax is a music city. The province is so musical. There should be more venues than there are now, and they should be, looked upon as community spaces.
Yeah.
That, enrich a community where people who are, have a condo, downtown, and they should be able to go to a cool venue to see, a young jazz artist or a young folk artist, or, if they want to go see a dance or an indie artist, like, have that ability. That doesn't exist right now in Halifax.
And it is just so inarguably enriching. Like, I think there's a spontaneous thing right? With regard to music, like there's just, it's something undeniable about it. I think anyway, and having that, would be transformative in my view. On that point though, like I wanted to ask you about, I guess this is an opening for plugs. Also, like the artists that you want to plug, what are the kinds of songwriting that usually resonates with you? Like, do you, and a kind of sub question here is like, I think when it comes to music, like what the weather stations, Ignorance, or even like Wise Blood's Titanic Rising, or there's a number of artists that are now explicitly writing songs about this coming catastrophe. Like there's a weird way in which they're trying to speak very earnestly without being like pedantic in their songs. Even Bo Burnham's Inside has that funny feeling with these lines like that, the unapparent air in late fall, the quiet comprehending of the ending of it all. These poetic lines, like they're not broadly speaking to the problem, right? They're not sort of heavy-handedly political. Is that what resonates primarily with you when it comes to music that does try and move into like a space of communicating the climate emergency? And what is it that you find most moving basically in music?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bibliophile. I love books and I love the words. I'm also someone who loves music from, Laurel Canyon days in the 60s and 70s, sort of like the birth of the singer-songwriter, in that sense where I want artists to put it all out on a record, and it's what they're feeling, whether it's love or anger or frustration, anything. And I appreciate the art form of being able to write these lyrics and then be able to put music to them. All of our artists are really cognizant of their life experience and then who they are as people, and they're still trying to figure it out. And so I always look stuff that speaks to me, and it's universal themes, but can be articulated in a way that is delivered poetically. Like when you look at, as Ignorance is a protest record, it's beautifully done, and you are drawn in through the lyrics by the production and the music. And it's somebody who has, the artists that appeal to us and that we want to work with have these big visions, and they have something to say.
Thanks so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime.